February 19th, 1942. President Roosevelt signs an order imprisoning 120,000 Japanese Americans, and declassified FBI documents reveal they were targeted not just for their race, but because two-thirds of them were Buddhist. While Christian worship was encouraged in the camps, Buddhist priests were arrested first, labeled dangerous threats, and their religion was seen as proof they could never be truly American. But what these imprisoned Buddhists did next, building makeshift temples from scrap wood, holding services behind barbed wire, and fighting for their right to be both Buddhist and American, would it prove that religious freedom could survive America's darkest hour, or expose it as a lie? The smell of incense drifted through the wooden doors of the Buddhist temple on a quiet Sunday morning in San Francisco. It was 1941, and the world felt small and safe inside these walls. Families in their best clothes sat on cushions, their children fidgeting beside them. The priest's voice rose and fell in a gentle chant that had been sung for thousands of years. Outside, cable cars clanged down the street. Inside, time moved differently. 10-year-old Masumi Kimura loved Sundays at the temple in California's Central Valley. Her father was an important man there, sitting on the board, helping make decisions about festivals and classes. He had arrived in America 20 years ago with nothing but a suitcase and a dream. Now he owned a small farm where peach trees grew in neat rows. The blossoms in spring looked like pink clouds touching the ground. Her mother grew vegetables between the trees. They weren't rich, but they had enough. The Buddhist community in California was strong in those days. Over 60,000 Japanese Americans practiced Buddhism up and down the West Coast. They had built temples in nearly every town where Japanese families lived. These weren't fancy buildings. Most were simple wooden structures with peaked roofs and small gardens. But inside each one, families found peace. They celebrated births and mourned deaths. They marked the seasons with festivals where children danced in bright kimonos and old men played drums that sounded like thunder. The temples served as more than places of worship. They were schools where children learned Japanese writing. They were meeting halls where farmers discussed crop prices. They were storage rooms where families kept photo albums and heirlooms. Buddhist priests married young couples and blessed newborn babies. They taught that suffering was part of life, but that peace could be found through understanding. They taught that all living things were connected. Most Japanese Americans had never seen Japan. They were born in America, in hospitals in Los Angeles and Sacramento and Seattle. They pledged allegiance to the American flag in school. They played baseball and ate hamburgers and listened to jazz on the radio. But they also went to temple on Sundays. They also celebrated Obon Festival in summer, dancing in circles to honor their ancestors. They also believed in the Buddha's teachings. To them, being Buddhist and being American were not opposite things. They were the same thing. The FBI did not see it that way. In secret offices in Washington, agents had been watching the Buddhist temples since 1936. They wrote reports about the priests. They made lists of names. They took photographs of who came and went. They believed that Buddhism made Japanese Americans loyal to Japan, not to America. They believed that Buddhist temples were dangerous places where people plotted against the country. They had no proof of this, but they believed it anyway. The political mood in America was changing like storm clouds gathering on a summer day. Japan's military had invaded China. Newspapers printed stories about Japanese cruelty. People began to look at their Japanese American neighbors with suspicion. Store owners refused to serve them. Children were called names at school. But life went on. The peach trees still bloomed. The temple bells still rang. December 7, 1941, started as an ordinary Sunday. Families were eating breakfast, some were at church, others were reading the newspaper. Then the radio announcements began. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Bombs had fallen. Ships were sinking. Over 2,000 Americans were dead. President Roosevelt's voice crackled over every radio in America. He called it a date that would live in infamy. He declared war on Japan. Masumi Kimura ran home from a friend's house when she heard the news. She found her house full of strange men in dark suits. Her mother sat frozen at the kitchen table. A man with cold eyes held a shotgun pointed at her mother's head. Her father was on his knees in the living room. Two men were hitting him with their fists. His face was bleeding. He tried to protect his head with his arms. The men were FBI agents. They had lists of names, and Masumi's father was on those lists. He was a board member at the Buddhist temple. That made him dangerous. That made him an enemy. Masumi had to translate because the agents spoke no Japanese, and her parents spoke little English. Her father's hands shook as they put handcuffs on his wrists. They took him away in a black car. Masumi and her mother stood in the doorway and watched until the car disappeared. That same day, in every city up and down the West Coast, FBI agents knocked on doors. They arrested Buddhist priests first. Before the sun set on December 7th, over 100 Buddhist leaders were in custody. They were taken to secret locations. Their families did not know where they went. The oldest priest arrested was 65 years old. He had lived in California for 40 years. He had taught Zen meditation to people of all races. He had broken no laws, but he was Buddhist, so he was taken. The temples stood empty that night. Candles that should have been lit stayed dark. Bells that should have rung stayed silent. Inside their homes, Japanese-American families whispered to each other in the dark. They wondered what would come next. Some of them had heard rumors. They had heard that the government might force them to leave their homes. They had heard the word camps. But they could not believe it. This was America. America had a constitution. America had freedom of religion. These things could not happen here. But on February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9266. The order did not mention Japanese Americans by name. It just said that anyone deemed a threat could be removed from the West Coast, but everyone knew what it meant. 120,000 people of Japanese descent would be forced from their homes. 70,000 of them were American citizens. 2/3 of them were Buddhist. And their religion, those declassified documents would later reveal, was a major reason they were marked as dangerous. The notices appeared on telephone poles and shop windows in March 1942. They were printed in black ink on white paper. Every Japanese-American family received one. The notices said they had 1 week to report for evacuation. They could bring only what they could carry. 2 suitcases per person. Nothing more. Families stared at these notices and tried to understand what was happening to their lives. What do you pack when you can only bring what fits in 2 suitcases? What do you leave behind when you don't know if you'll ever come home? Families sold their farms for almost nothing. Cars worth $500 sold for $50. Refrigerators, washing machines, furniture passed down through generations. Everything went for pennies. White neighbors stood in yards and offered insultingly low prices. They knew these families had no choice. Some neighbors promised to watch over houses and businesses. Most of those promises were lies. The Buddhist temples opened their doors one last time. Families brought their most precious belongings: photo albums, wedding kimonos, hand-painted scrolls of Buddhist scripture, small Buddha statues wrapped in cloth. The priests locked these treasures in basement storage rooms. They hoped the items would be safe. They hoped they would return. Some families buried their Buddhist altars in their backyards. They wrapped them in canvas and dug holes 3 feet deep. They covered the holes with dirt and planted flowers on top. If anyone asked, they would say nothing. The trains came in April. Families lined up at stations with their suitcases and tags pinned to their coats. The tags had numbers on them. The people were no longer called by their names. Masumi Kimura was now number 18743. Her mother was 18744. They did not know where they were going. Armed soldiers with rifles stood on the platforms. The trains had windows, but the shades were pulled down. No one was allowed to look out. The first stop was not the final destination. These were called assembly centers, but they were really livestock fairgrounds and racetracks. The Portland Assembly Center had been used for pigs and cattle shows. The Santa Anita Center in California was a horse racetrack. Families were given stalls where animals had lived. The smell of manure soaked into the wooden walls. No amount of scrubbing could get it out. The floors were dirt mixed with old hay. Some stalls still had metal rings where horses had been tied. Masumi's family got a stall that was 10 feet by 20 feet. It had been a horse stall 3 weeks earlier. Her mother swept the floor 6 times, but the smell remained. They hung blankets on the walls to create privacy. They laid thin mattresses on the ground. These mattresses were canvas bags stuffed with straw. The straw poked through and scratched their skin at night. Each stall housed an entire family. Sometimes 2 families shared one stall with a sheet hung between them as a wall. The toilets were the worst part. They were in a long building with no dividers between them. 20 toilets in a row with no walls, no doors, no privacy. Women and girls had to sit next to strangers. They learned to go late at night when fewer people were there. They learned to look at the floor and pretend they were alone. The younger children cried. The older ones stopped talking about it. Food came from mess halls. Families stood in lines 3 times a day, holding metal trays. The food was not like home cooking. Everything was boiled or fried in big industrial pots. Potatoes, canned vegetables, mystery meat. The meals were designed to feed thousands of people as cheaply as possible. Children who had eaten their mother's cooking now ate from assembly lines. But at least there was enough food. No one went hungry. In the assembly centers, families noticed something strange. Christian worship services were encouraged. The camp directors helped Christian ministers set up churches. They provided buildings and supplies. They announced service times over loudspeakers. But when Buddhist families asked to hold services, they were told no. Buddhism was still considered dangerous. Buddhist priests who had not been arrested were watched closely. Some families started attending Christian services just to have somewhere to pray. Some converted because they heard Christians were treated better. The rumors said Buddhists were being punished more harshly. The rumors said Buddhism would mark you as disloyal. After months in the assembly centers, the families were moved again, this time to permanent camps in the desert. 10 camps scattered across 7 states. Manzanar in California, Topaz in Utah, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Minidoka in Idaho. These camps were built in the middle of nowhere, hundreds of miles from any city, surrounded by barbed wire fences. Guard towers stood at each corner with searchlights and machine guns. The guns pointed inward, toward the prisoners, not outward for their protection. The barracks were simple wooden buildings covered in tar paper. Each building was divided into 6 units. Each unit was 20 feet by 25 feet. In these 500 square feet, entire families lived, sometimes 7 or 8 people in one room. The walls were thin boards with gaps between them. Desert sand blew through the cracks. In summer, temperatures reached 110 degrees. The tar paper turned the barracks into ovens. In winter, temperatures dropped below zero. The thin walls did nothing to keep out the cold. Families stuffed newspaper in the cracks to stop the wind. Masumi watched dust storms roll across the desert. The sky would turn brown. Sand got into everything. It was in their food, in their beds, in their hair and clothes. They tied bandanas over their faces but still breathed in dust. Some people got sick from it. The old people coughed all night. But here, in these permanent camps, something unexpected began to happen. Buddhist families started to ask questions. If this was America, where was religious freedom? If they were citizens, where were their rights? They had been told they were dangerous because of their religion. They had been arrested, removed from their homes, and imprisoned behind barbed wire. And now, watching Christian services get support while Buddhist requests were denied, they began to understand something. Their faith was not just under attack. It was being used as proof they did not belong. The question forming in their minds was simple but powerful. Could they be both Buddhist and American? Or would America force them to choose? The turning point came on a cold Sunday morning in November 1942. Families in the Topaz camp in Utah woke to frost on the ground. The sky was gray and heavy. Masumi's mother wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and said she wanted to pray. She wanted to honor her ancestors. She wanted to light incense and bow before a Buddha statue like her grandmother had taught her. But there was no temple. There were no priests. Buddhism was still being treated as the enemy religion. That morning, a group of Buddhist families met in secret in one of the barracks. They sat in a circle on the floor. Someone had carved a small Buddha from a piece of scrap wood. It was only 6 inches tall and rough around the edges, but it was enough. They placed it on an empty crate covered with a cloth. An old woman lit a candle. Another woman began to chant in a voice that shook with emotion. The chant was one they all knew from childhood. The words spoke of suffering and compassion, and the path to peace. Tears ran down their faces. These were not tears of sadness alone. They were tears of defiance. After that secret meeting, the Buddhist families made a decision. They would not hide anymore. They would not pretend to be something they were not. If America promised religious freedom, then they would demand it. If the Constitution protected all religions, then it must protect Buddhism too. They were American citizens. They were born here. They spoke English. They loved this country even though this country had imprisoned them. And they would prove that being Buddhist did not make them any less American. The Buddhists began petitioning the camp authorities. They wrote letters. They organized meetings. They asked for the same rights that Christians had. At first, the authorities said no. Buddhism was still viewed with suspicion. Camp directors worried that Buddhist gatherings would breed disloyalty. But the families kept asking. They were polite but firm. They quoted the Constitution. They quoted the Bill of Rights. They reminded the directors that 2/3 of the camp population was Buddhist. Finally, slowly, permission was granted. In the Topaz camp, Bishop Ryotai Matsukage reopened the headquarters of the Buddhist Mission of North America. He had been evacuated from San Francisco and imprisoned here like everyone else. He was an educated man who spoke perfect English. He understood that Buddhism needed to adapt to survive in America. He made a bold decision. He changed the organization's name to the Buddhist Churches of America. The word mission sounded foreign and suspicious. The word churches sounded American and familiar. It was a small change in words, but a giant change in meaning. Buddhism was not a foreign religion being spread by outsiders. It was an American religion practiced by American citizens. Other changes followed. Buddhists started meeting on Sundays instead of traditional days. They called their gatherings services instead of ceremonies. They called their priests reverend instead of using Japanese titles. They began singing gathas, which were Buddhist poems and teachings set to music. These gathas were printed in booklets that looked like Christian hymnals. Young Yoshiko Hyde, who was Masumi's age, sang from one of these booklets at the Heart Mountain Camp in Wyoming. The words were in both English and Japanese. One gatha said that freedom was not won by prayer alone, but by action and understanding. Another reminded them that Buddha's teachings lived in how they treated each other, especially in hard times. The camps became places of surprising creativity. Families built makeshift Buddhist altars called butsudan from scrap lumber. They carved tiny Buddha statues from wood scraps. They painted Buddhist scriptures on smooth stones they found in the desert. One priest, Reverend Nichikan Murakita, was a master of calligraphy. He spent hours carefully painting sacred texts onto rocks and bits of wood. He taught others to do the same. This practice was called Shakyo, and Buddhists believed it brought spiritual merit. But in the camps, it meant something more. Each brushstroke was an act of resistance. Each character painted was a statement that their faith would not be erased. The most powerful symbol of their determination stood at Manzanar Camp in California. Buddhist and Christian leaders worked together to build a monument in the camp cemetery. It was a white concrete tower that pointed toward the sky. The monument was 10 feet tall and paid for by donations from families who had almost nothing. Each family gave what they could. The dedication ceremony happened on August 14, 1943, during the Obon Festival, when Buddhists honor their ancestors. Hundreds of people gathered around the monument. Buddhist priests chanted. Christian ministers prayed. The inscription on the monument said, "I re tu," in beautiful calligraphy. It meant, monument to venerate the spirit of the deceased. It honored everyone who had died in the camps. It honored Buddhist and Christian alike. It stood as proof that even in this terrible place, faith survived. Inside the barracks at night, Masumi's mother would tell her stories. She said that Buddha taught that suffering was part of life, but Buddha also taught that suffering could teach you wisdom. She said these camps were a kind of suffering, but they were also teaching Japanese Americans something important. They were teaching them that America was not perfect. The Constitution was just words on paper, unless people fought to make those words real. Religious freedom was not something given by the government. It was something you had to claim and defend. A young Buddhist man incarcerated in Arkansas wrote in his diary that he wanted Americans to know Buddhism was nothing to fear. He wrote that by their actions and deeds, people would come to see that Buddhism could make America greater and finer. His words captured what thousands of imprisoned Buddhists felt. They were not trying to destroy America. They were trying to save the best part of America. They were trying to prove that a nation could be strong and diverse at the same time. That people of different faiths could be equally American. The transformation was complete. Japanese American Buddhists had arrived at the camps expecting to be forced to give up their faith. Some had expected pressure to convert. Some had expected their religion to be banned entirely. Instead, they found something they never imagined. They found their own power. They found that their imprisonment gave them a platform. They found that their suffering gave them moral authority. By insisting on their right to practice Buddhism, they were not just defending their own faith. They were defending every American's freedom. They were proving that America belonged to everyone, or it belonged to no one. The war ended in August 1945. Japan surrendered after atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. President Truman announced that all Japanese Americans could leave the camps and return home. The gates opened. The guard towers emptied. Families packed their 2 suitcases again, this time heading in the opposite direction. They had been imprisoned for 3.5 years. Some of the children leaving the camps had been babies when they arrived. They had no memory of life before barbed wire. Masumi Kimura was 13 years old when she stepped off the train in California's Central Valley. She barely recognized her hometown. The peach orchard her father had planted was gone. Someone else owned the land now. The trees had been cut down and sold for firewood. The house where she grew up had been stripped bare. Every window was broken. The walls were covered in hateful words painted in black. Someone had stolen the copper pipes. The kitchen where her mother had cooked was full of trash and dead leaves. Across California and up the West Coast, Japanese-American families came home to similar destruction. Their businesses had been sold or stolen. Their bank accounts had been emptied. Their neighbors had moved into their houses and refused to leave. Some families found signs that said, "No Japs allowed," hanging in shop windows. Some found crosses burning in their yards. They had been imprisoned by their own government for being a supposed threat. Now they were being punished by their neighbors for coming home. But the Buddhist families carried something back with them that could not be stolen or destroyed. They carried the books of gathas they had sung in the camps. They carried the small Buddha statues carved from scrap wood. They carried the painted stones and the hand-copied scriptures. Yoshiko Hyde kept her gatha book hidden in a trunk for decades. When she finally took it out years later, the pages were yellow and fragile. But the words were still there. The words about freedom and understanding and not giving up. More importantly, they carried a transformed faith. Buddhism in America had changed in those camps. It had become something new. Before the war, Buddhist services were mostly conducted in Japanese. Now they were in English. Before the war, Buddhism seemed like something foreign that immigrants brought from the old country. Now it was something their American-born children claimed as their own. The Buddhist churches of America continued after the war. The name stuck. The Sunday services stuck. The English language stuck. A new form of Buddhism had been born, one that was unmistakably American. The camps also taught Japanese Americans something painful but necessary about their country. America's promise of freedom was not automatic. It had to be fought for. The Constitution protected religious freedom, but only if people demanded that protection. The Bill of Rights was powerful, but only if citizens held their government accountable. Democracy was fragile. It could fail. It could be swept away by fear and prejudice, but it could also be rebuilt by people who refused to give up on its ideals. Buddhist temples became centers of Japanese-American communities again after the war. In Los Angeles and San Francisco and Seattle, families gathered at temples to rebuild their lives. The temples were more than places of worship. They were proof that the community had survived. Some of the original priests came back from the camps. Others had died there. New priests were ordained. Young people who had grown up in the camps decided to dedicate their lives to Buddhism. They wanted to honor what their parents and grandparents had protected. The monument at Manzanar still stands today. Every year, thousands of people make a pilgrimage to the campsite. They gather around the white concrete tower in the cemetery. They hold an interfaith service. Buddhists and Christians and people of all faiths stand together. They remember what happened there. They remember the injustice. But they also remember the resistance. They remember how imprisoned people fought for their dignity and their faith. They remember that religious freedom was defended by people who had every reason to give up but chose to fight instead. In 1988, 43 years after the camps closed, Congress finally apologized. President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act. It said that the imprisonment of Japanese Americans was caused by racial prejudice, war hysteria, and failed political leadership. It said the government had violated the Constitution. Each survivor received $20,000 and a formal apology. It was not enough money to repay what had been stolen. No amount of money could give back those lost years, but the apology mattered. It was an admission that America had been wrong. The declassified documents told the full story. FBI reports showed that Japanese Americans were targeted partly because they were Buddhist. Government officials believed that Buddhism made them loyal to Japan instead of America. There was never any evidence of this. Not a single Japanese American was ever convicted of espionage or sabotage during the war. They were imprisoned because of what they looked like and what they believed. Their religion was used as proof of disloyalty, but in the camps, they proved the opposite. They showed that you could be Buddhist and American. They showed that America was big enough for many faiths. What did those imprisoned Buddhists really learn behind the barbed wire? They learned that freedom is not something you have. It is something you do. They learned that faith is not just what you believe in your heart. It is what you are willing to defend when everything is taken from you. They learned that America is not a fixed thing. It is a constant struggle between its best ideals and its worst fears. And they learned that ordinary people, when pushed to the edge, can become heroes simply by refusing to surrender who they are. Today, Buddhism is recognized as an American religion. There are Buddhist temples in every major city. Buddhist meditation is taught in schools and hospitals. Buddhist ideas about mindfulness and compassion have become part of American culture. None of this would have happened without those families in the camps who insisted on their right to practice their faith. They transformed Buddhism, but more than that, they transformed America's understanding of religious freedom. The lesson from the camps is simple but profound. Religious freedom does not protect itself. Each generation must defend it. When the government targets people because of their faith, whether Buddhist or Muslim or any other religion, citizens must speak up. When fear and prejudice threaten constitutional rights, people must resist. The Japanese American Buddhists showed us how. They showed us that the deepest patriotism is not blind loyalty. It is holding your country to its highest promises, even when that country has betrayed you, especially then. That is what they learned in captivity. That is what they have taught us. And that is the legacy that survives.